Hey folks, Zach Osterman, Insider Indianapolis Star. Not exactly sure what we're going to call this. Some sort of Monday update, I guess. Um, just kind of over the weekend, Matt Glennesk, my editor, asked me to put together just kind of a recap of Indiana's transfer portal work so far. I think just about everybody watching is probably familiar with it. But just kind of to reset now that it feels like a lot of the major pieces are in place for Indiana, and to kind of give an idea of how those pieces might begin to fit together. Obviously, those players won't be on campus together until probably late May or early June. But to get a sense for, just kind of essentially the vision once you can see more of the forest and not just the individual trees. And I wanted to shoot this video just as a kind of companion piece to that with a few thoughts. Nothing, I guess, not super organized, but just kind of some thoughts on maybe why some of these players, how some of this works, it might work, etc. I think the first thing that really jumps off the page is that while Indiana took Umar Balo and they confirmed him just a few minutes ago, the program announced his signing essentially as a transfer. He's the third of the four committed transfers and the fourth of five incoming players that Indiana's added in this spring period that the program has officially confirmed, which means the paperwork's gone through, everything is sort of rubber stamped, everything's approved. While Indiana added Balo, it does very much look like Mike Woodson is preparing to play more flexible basketball and more small ball this year. You bring Balo in, presumably he'll start next to Malik Renew, and I do expect Indiana to try and add, and probably will add, another front court piece as a backup to those two, because you can't just go into the season with two true front court players. There's injuries, there's foul trouble, whatever. But I think when you look at where Indiana's roster is, while your starting front court may well be Mbako, Renew, Balo, I think your first probably forward options off the bench at this point are probably going to be Bryson Tucker and Luke Goody. And what that's going to mean is sliding one of Renew or Balo to the 5, Mbako presumably to the 4, though I suppose in a push Goody could play there as well. He was an underrated rebounder in his healthier seasons at Illinois, with either Bryson Tucker at the 3 or Indiana playing 3-guard lineups, because you can put Trey Galloway, who's a bit of a 6'4", 6'5", a little bit bigger. If you need to play small, Galloway can be, can play the 3 for you and not give up a ton of size. That is obviously a marked departure from where Indiana's been the last 2-3 seasons in terms of, that there has been a pretty steady kind of commitment to not just too big basketball to start games, but to kind of persist with it. We did see Indiana move away from some of that last season, and sometimes that was, to be completely honest, sometimes that was forced by injuries. Sometimes that was, maybe around Mike Woodson just shrinking his rotations in general. But it's worth saying, if you look at Indiana's most frequent lineups over the last 5 games of last season, according to Ken Pomeroy, Mackenzie Mbako appears in 8 of them. In 6 of those 8, he's the 3, but in 2 of those 8, he's the 4. It's the 10th most used lineup in that, sort of span. But Anthony Walker also plays the 4 in one of those lineups as well. So Indiana was maybe transitioning toward some of that toward the end of last season. And it's also worth saying Indiana played Khalil Ware a lot toward the end of last season. I mean, he appears in all 10 of Indiana's most used lineups over the last 5 games of last season. And if you look at his, his minutes totals, over the last 6 games, 32, 36, 37, 34, 39, 38. In fact, starting on February 18th, he plays 32 or more minutes every night, save the Penn State game where I think he had some early foul trouble, and he ends with 4 fouls. I don't necessarily think Indiana's going to play Balo quite so much and I'm looking up here at Ken Pom profiles while we're talking. You look at, Balo has never played more than 68.8% of his team's available minutes in a single season. Ware was at 72.9% last season. He was at 73.4 in conference play. And again, those numbers were even higher on an individual game basis by the end of last season. Balo is a different kind of center. Obviously, you're going to ask him to do different things. But I think you are going to see a little bit more of Indiana, either playing small with Renew at the 5, which is going to give up some defensive, strength, is, potentially going to give up some rebounding. But the flip side is you're going to have an incredibly offensively dynamic lineup, maybe as dynamic 1 through 5 as Mike Woodson's had. If you do go to those sets with either Goody or Tucker at the 3, and Bako at the 4, and then one of your two sort of starting bigs at the 5, you'll still need another big, because you can't just kind of be constantly, ping-ponging Renew and Balo in for one another. But I think there's a world where, that big is just playing a few minutes a night, kind of bridging the gap between the two players. We've seen the links to, I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, Nikita Konstantinovsky from Monmouth. But I think that player is probably bridging the gap a little bit. And someone like Mbako, someone like Tucker, someone like Goody is seeing a lot more minutes split between the 3 and maybe the 4. And so I think that's the first thing that jumps out, is I do genuinely think Indiana is going to be in a position to play, and I think is going to want to play, and is going to commit to more offensively flexible lineups. I think the second thing that jumps off the page is Balo himself. Arizona has been, over Balo's 3 seasons in Tucson, one of the best rebounding teams in the country. They were outstanding rebounding the ball offensively and defensively last season. They were top 20 in both offensive rebound rate and opponent offensive rebound rate. A couple years ago, they were better at clearing the boards than they were at grabbing offensive rebounds. Lloyd's first season, they were a great offensive rebounding team, not as good defensive rebounding. But the point is, there's always been a force, at Arizona on the boards, and there has always been an ability to sort of weaponize, the boards, whether it's clearing them defensively or obviously adding extra possessions offensively. Balo has been essentially the reason for that. If you look at Arizona last season, for example, the only player who played more than 45% of available minutes and even had a defensive rebounding rate over 14% was Keshad Johnson. By comparison, Balo's defensive rebound rate was almost 27%. His offensive rebound rate was actually higher than the defensive rebound rate of any Arizona player in Lloyd's top 7. That is rebounding dominance, frankly. And in conference play, he was even better. For a team in Indiana that struggled so much, when you talk about efficiency, you talk about, I think people tend to think about 3-point shooting, turnovers, things like that. A big part of efficiency, particularly defensively, is clearing the boards and just ending possessions. If you can't secure the defensive rebounds, you can't defend, because you can't end the possession. Indiana had huge trouble with that last season. They were 211th nationally in offensive rebounding percentage. They were 9th in the Big Ten, in opponent offensive rebounding percentage, I should say. They were 9th in the Big Ten in that same statistic. Balo is not a cure-all by himself, but he's about the closest thing you can find in this year's, portal class to being the kind of dominant rebounder that improves those numbers almost immediately, both because of his ability and also because of his presence and the extent to which opposing teams might not try to gamble on certain, in certain situations, to try and go, challenge for rebounds they don't think they're going to get, that might leave them with, trouble on the break, because Indiana's also recruited a couple players in Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle who are very good passers, Rice in particular, and they were actually very good last season if you watch their film in, basically initiating the break, whether it's getting on the open floor themselves or, skip ahead passes, things like that, kind of getting the ball up the floor quickly. You're not going to want to send 3-4 guys to the rim if you don't feel like you're going to be able to get that offensive rebound with Balo in the game, because that might leave you exposed in transition. And Balo's, suddenly his presence, can sort of tilt the court in your favor in more ways than one if you kind of go from, beyond just sort of step one of who gets the rebound to step two and step three of what happens next, who's at an advantage, who's at a disadvantage. The other question I would have with Balo is his block rate. It's always been good. It's never been elite by any means. But this is where I will always kind of cite Trace Jackson Davis in particular. He was a good shot blocker over his first 2 seasons at Indiana. He became a borderline elite shot blocker in his last 2. And Kel'el Ware, obviously, Ware took a big jump in a lot of different areas, from an overall sort of standpoint. He was block rate kind of stood steady, especially if you look at his conference play only numbers. But that was that was while playing essentially 3 times as many minutes. So there's, kind of to see those numbers broadly kind of stay the same, especially in conference play, conference games alone, when he's playing a lot more and his role's a lot bigger, suggests he also got better under Mike Woodson protecting the rim. And I think that's something to look out for. The third one, and I didn't want to go crazy with this, the third sort of thing that I kind of got that sticks out about this group is those 2 guards and the extent to which it feels like, especially if one or both of them can become, pretty reliable defensively, they solve a lot of problems for you. Rice is a pure point guard in many ways, but as anybody who's kind of looked into his background knows, it wasn't like he wasn't scoring the ball last season. He was averaging almost 15 points per game. Despite not shooting the ball particularly well from 3, he had one prolonged drought, I think of like 0 of 21 or 0 of 22 late in the regular season. But he's still averaging, despite not necessarily, being the most efficient offensive player, he was still averaging almost 15 points per game for a team that won, I think, 25 games and went to the round of 32. So there's not a lot about his numbers that you would feel is sort of, I guess, empty, or I don't know what the word would be, just kind of, not sort of trustworthy, beyond the fact that he does need to shoot the ball better. But his assist rate speaks for itself. It was 22.7% overall last season. It actually went up 3 points in conference play, despite the fact that his turnover rate only went up 1/10 of a point. So he was essentially a much more efficient creator and distributor in Pac-12 games than overall, and he was able to do that without any real sort of increase to the risks he took, the mistakes he made, those sorts of things. He got to the free throw line a lot. He was top 20 in both fouls drawn per 40 minutes and free throw rate in conference play, and he was also top 20 in just free throw shooting percentage, which, both he and Kanan Carlisle were very good free throw shooters last year. I think Indiana fans would welcome seeing both of those guys at the line a little bit more. And then Carlisle's the more interesting one, because you kind of look at Carlisle and you obviously stack him next to Trey Galloway, who was so good for Indiana over the latter maybe half of last season. Certainly kind of from February onward, it felt like he really found a groove, running Mike Woodson's ball screen offense. We saw what he did with his assist numbers. The shooting percentages never quite got up to where they were a season ago. But Galloway's also had the offseason knee issues and the procedure and kind of what he was talking about at the end of last season. We'll see kind of where he comes back from that. Carlisle is a player that can fill a lot of different holes for you. He handled the ball a bit for Stanford last season. He finished last season with again, he was another player whose assist rate went up in conference play compared to overall. His turnover rate was still higher than his assist rate in Pac-12 play, but it did go down compared to his overall number. So he kind of probably got a little more comfortable in that role as time went on. He used the 3rd most possessions of any player in the Pac-12, which is an incredibly high number for a freshman, and gives you a sense for just, you can use possessions for your own shot, to draw fouls. You can use them to create for others, but it gives you a sense for how involved he was. He could probably stand to be a better guard rebounder, but that's, not something I think Indiana's going to look at and sort of say is a weakness in his game when you consider how capable he was drawing fouls, getting to the free throw line, making free throws. And if you kind of believe in his growth, he missed that, I think, about the first month of last season. He started 2 of 13 behind the three-point line, and he actually finished 30 of 87, which is 34.5%. And if you kind of believe in that as maybe more of his freshman year baseline behind the three-point line, it's not hard to talk yourself into the idea that he can shoot 37, 38% across the course of a full season, especially with maybe in an offense that does not rely on him to have the ball in his hands quite so much. With another year, obviously, of seasoning and strength and conditioning and all that stuff we talk about with young players. He was only a freshman last season. Again, he missed the first part of the season, so he kind of had to dive in with both hands, or with both feet, I should say. I guess you dive in with your hands sometimes. Stream of consciousness there for you on a Monday morning. But what strikes you with Carlisle is you look at his profile and he can kind of be 2, 3, 4 different sorts of players for Indiana, depending on what you need from him. He can be a sort of an alternate point guard. He can, I suspect, and time will tell, but I suspect he can be an effective catch and shoot player. Again, like Rice, unless the percentages just absolutely fall off a cliff, he can be the sort of player that really improves where Indiana's at from a free throw shooting perspective. And how many times last season did we say that a game was too close because of free throw shooting, or Indiana left itself with too much to do, from an offensive perspective because it couldn't convert enough of its free throws, those sorts of things. Carlisle, whether he starts or he comes off the bench, is the sort of player that it almost kind of feels like, on one night his impact on winning can be this, and on the next night it's something else, and on the next night it's something else. But what you realize is that the overall package is just this player that can help you in a lot of different ways. And so I'm intrigued by not just, some of the credentials I guess those two guards bring with them, especially Rice, obviously Pac-12 Freshman of the Year, the way he ran that offense, his reputation in particular in high ball screen and pick and roll sets, which, Mike Woodson's offenses have virtually always across the last 3 seasons been at their best when they've not necessarily run solely on ball screens, but they have been able to rely heavily on their ball screen offense. That has consistently been I would argue anyway, when we've seen the best of Indiana's offense beyond obviously just Trace Jackson Davis's individual brilliance a couple of seasons ago. Rice really helps you in that regard, at least on paper. But I'm also struck by just how versatile these two guys are and how much it suddenly feels like Indiana's kind of got dynamism in that backcourt, where last season we were just constantly asking about depth. And, obviously that was about, Gabe Cupps going through some freshmen, sort of learning curve. That was a big part of that was, of course, Xavier Johnson's injuries and the fact that he never really seemed to find his rhythm. But now you got two guys that can come in and I think can tick a lot of different boxes on any given night for you, particularly Carlisle, but Rice as well a little bit. And that just adds dimensions to a backcourt that really needed to be, not just from a three-point shooting perspective, but overall just a lot more dynamic than it has been, maybe the previous 12 months. So those are kind of some thoughts for now, I guess. To wrap it, to sort of round it off, I don't think Indiana feels compelled to use both of its remaining scholarships. Again, Nikita Konstantinovsky is a name that has been sort of bubbling up since last week. We'll see what kind of, sort of form that takes at time of recording. I have not heard anything about a visit being confirmed. That sort of stuff only takes one phone call. So by the time you watch this, it might already be on the calendar. I do think that the one need Indiana still has is just a big that it feels like it can trust to play, 10, 12, maybe 15, solid Big Ten level minutes, Big Ten quality minutes a night, even in a reserve role, even, if that player goes on the floor and is probably the 4th or 5th offensive option at any given moment. Just someone that can bridge the gap when rotations get a little shrunk, or someone who obviously can fill in the event of foul trouble or injury or whatever it might be. I think that's probably still a need for Indiana. The want would be, could you add some guard depth? Could you add some shooting? Obviously, you're in a position now where a lot of your minutes, a lot of your rotation spots are kind of de facto spoken for. I know coaches will always say, "Oh, it's always up for grabs. It's got to be earned through competition and all that." But you know, other players are going to look at Indiana's situation and say, "Oh, they're probably good for now." So you're going to have to be a little bit, sort of more selective in terms of maybe targeting players that would be comfortable playing from closer to the end of your bench. And that's why sometimes it's harder to fill that 13th spot when you are having to go so portal heavy in your sort of spring roster construction. But there have been some mentions of Alex Hemingway or Hemingway. I think it's Hemingway, not Hemingway. The guard from Newburgh, who's spent the last few years at Clemson. I think Hemingway's also got some interest in some other sort of Midwest schools. Unsurprisingly, I heard his name mentioned alongside Evansville, which is essentially his hometown school. But I think Indiana can slow play that 13th spot a little bit more, be a little bit more selective, and just kind of see sort of what shakes out of the tree as time goes on, because so many of these boxes have been ticked. So that was quite a long video. If you made it to the end of it, then God bless you. We'll have more as obviously maybe the sort of roster construction portion of this offseason begins to wind down. I don't think Indiana's done, but obviously Indiana does not have a ton more to do. But for now, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for watching as always, and we will talk to you soon.